Well, I have some time and I wanted to uh, do a video on something that I thought about when I was doing my dissertation, and it occurred to me that it would be an interesting little topic. I don't think I have a whole lot to say about it, but I never know how long I am going to be when I start on these programs. And the topic is Jesus as teacher in the Gospel of Mark. And it may have been Burton Mack, who's a very radical, I think he's dead now, but a very radical interpreter of the Bible and the New Testament. And he's got a book on the Gospel of Mark, A Myth of Innocence, very skeptical and radical. But I think it may have been him who pointed out that in the very first public uh, action of Jesus, besides his baptism, if you want to call that public, he's joined a crowd, and a voice was heard from the heavens, and he goes to the desert and then calls, or is proclaiming the good news, and calls the first four. But the actual sort of, first official act of his ministry, described in any detail, is the famous casting out, if you will, of the possessed man, the man possessed by an unclean spirit in Mark chapter 1, which is one of the first things that I needed to look at in my dissertation. And what was and what happens as to go over it a little bit, Jesus is in Capernaum. I should have probably done this before, but he's in Capernaum and goes into the synagogue on a Sabbath, as is his custom. And there he meets this unclean man possessed by an unclean spirit. And there's this exchange with the man. But before that, it says that he began to teach. So he was teaching in this synagogue. And it doesn't say what he was teaching. But the people are astonished at his teaching because he taught them as one having exousia and not like the scribes. Right there, my dissertation, its original title was called Exorcism, Exousia, the Widow, and the Temple, because I saw that this exorcism was certainly connected with Jesus's exousia, which is translated authority, but really in Latin it is potestas, and in Daniel 7, where it comes from, our Bibles translate dominion. So exousia is I looked it up in my research, the ability to act unhindered by legal, moral, or physical obstacles. It's real power. That's why I said that the Son of Man or one like a Son of Man in Daniel 7 is a plenipotentiary. He's got the full powers. So Jesus goes into the synagogue and begins to teach. And the people are astounded, amazed at his didache. Now, didache is teaching, or you could say doctrine, and I think it's really the equivalent in Greek of Torah, which is mostly priestly, which is primarily priestly teaching. What we know as the Torah, the first 5 books, in Greek it's translated nomos, law, but and already in Aramaic, in the book of Ezra's, it'll be called dat, which is law. So yes, the Torah begins, or the collection of the 5 books that are known as the Torah, even though Torah can maybe stand for the whole revelation of God, that comes to be known as the law, with 613 commandments, whatever. But it's really teaching. Actually, it's related to reigning. That's why the more Zedekiah in Hosea and in Qumran, etc., the teacher of righteousness, has to do with reigning and shooting arrows and maybe pointing. So it's a very interesting word, and I want to emphasize that broadness of the word, because we're going to see that in Mark there are various references to Jesus' teaching with very little description of the contents of the teaching, unless you wanted to maybe talk about some parables, the parable of the sower, or maybe there are, I don't think there's that many parables in, I mean, there are some parables in Mark, but not like Luke, where you could say he has all these parables of the prodigal son and the good Samaritan and all kinds of other things. Jesus doesn't even have the parable of the wise virgins or anything. And Matthew, of course, is supposed to be Jesus as Moses in 5 books, and the discourses, the Sermon on the Mount, or Luke has the Sermon on the Plain, and John has Jesus giving these long discourses. There you could say he's more of a teacher. But it's interesting to explore exactly what this teaching of Jesus in Mark consists of. And so he has, they were amazed at his didache, at his teaching, because he taught them with exousia, with this special word of full power, and not like the scribes. So that immediately, of course, there's the man with the unclean spirit. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? You have come to destroy us, or maybe it's usually phrased as a question. Have you come to destroy us? Which the answer would be yes. And Jesus, as I pointed out before, is addressed. I know who you are, the Holy One of God, which is really a priestly title. In Psalm 106:16, it's applied to Aaron. The Holy One of Yahweh is Aaron, parallel to the Eucharistic discourse in John 6. You are the Holy One of God, says Peter to Jesus. So typically, Torah is priestly teaching on matters of pure and impure and some other matters. We're going to see that Jesus in chapter 7 of Mark distinguishes between pure and impure. something that priests in Ezekiel are accused of being negligent of. Kind of giving you an overview of what I have to say. In Ezekiel 22, the prophet lambasts Jerusalem for its crimes, social crimes, etc. The word of Yahweh came to me in these terms: Son of man, tell it you are a land. Very interesting. See, I discover things when I do these videos. You are a land which has not had rain. I was just talking about how the verb root for Torah has to do with raining, and the teacher of righteousness can be called also the rainer of righteousness in Hosea and even in Qumran. Nor have you had any flooding or being watered in the day of wrath. The princes, the leaders that reside in her are like a roaring lion that dismembers its prey. They have devoured the people. They have gotten a hold of their property and jewels. They have multiplied widows in her midst. Very similar to Mark 12, with woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, who devour widows' houses and living. Of course, Ezekiel 34 is going to have against the bad shepherds who feed and clothe off the sheep, just like the scribes and Pharisees like banquets and long clothing. See these parallels. Her priests have violated my Torah and have profaned my sacred things. They have not distinguished between sacred and profane. They have not taught to distinguish pure and impure, between pure and impure. They have stopped their, or closed their eyes to not see my Sabbaths, and have dishonored me in their midst, etc. And then, of course, in the eschaton, or in the end time, when the new temple comes down and everything is restored and redeemed and made good, then the priests will distinguish between pure and impure in chapter 44 of Ezekiel. They will teach my people to distinguish between the sacred and the profane, and to know the difference between pure and impure. So got a little bit ahead of myself, but Jesus is giving this didache, which could be like a Torah, which can also be interpreted as the way to relate to God, or to be put right with God, which is, I think, going to be seen to be not a matter of information, even though information forms you from the inside. And education takes out what you may already know, or makes manifest, or allows you to elicit, lead out, educere, what you know. So that Jesus has power over this unclean spirit. He rebukes him the same way he's going to rebuke the sea in chapter 4. uh, and tells him to muzzle himself the same way he's going to tell the sea to be muzzled, or muzzle yourself like a rabid beast. So there's this link between Jesus' teaching and power, this exousia, dominion of the Son of Man, this full authority to effectuate his will, or God's will. And of course, in chapter 4 of Mark, when he calms the sea, the disciples ask, they're also filled with great fear, and ask, who is this who even sea and wind obey? Let me see if in Mark 4:41 we have a very similar astonishment verb. It's a little bit different. It's just the fear verb. So that they're all amazed, and they questioned themselves. They questioned among themselves, uh, saying, "What is this? A new teaching, a didache kaine." And the description, as was pointed out by either Burton Mack or someone else, is it's a new teaching according to exousia, and the unclean spirits commands, and they obey him. So the teaching is described as having the power to command unclean spirits and have them obey him. Now that's a strange way to describe a teaching. You would think the teaching of Thomas Aquinas, or the teaching of Aristotle, or somebody else's teaching would consist of what we call information. In the case of Jesus, it seems to be a power. If we went to Mark 6, it's very interesting. Mark 6 is the multiplication of the breads or the loaves, and the disciples are around Jesus, and they're telling him everything that they had taught when they went out in their mission. In chapter 6, they are sent on mission. And going hence, it says in Mark 6, verse 12, they preached conversion, and they cast out many demons, and they anointed with oil many of the sick and healed them. And so now in chapter 6 of Mark, again in verse 30 now, the apostles gather around Jesus and tell him everything that they had done and taught. So Mark is closely associating teaching with healing and casting out demons. Just like he'll use the word salvation for healing with the woman with the blood flow, and I think in other cases, there's a blurry lines between the facets of salvation, if you will. Salvation defined as being close to God, being put right with God, even physically improving and being healthier. Salus is salvation and health, you know, in Latin. But here, in the multiplication of the loaves, the first one, uh, he says to them, let's go to a solitary place and rest a bit, because there was so much activity they didn't even have time to eat. And many came from everywhere, and Jesus saw many people, and he felt compassion over them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Mark 6:34 began to teach them many things. Again, not a word about what he was teaching them. But what is narrated in detail is that when it's time to eat, instead of the easy solution of sending the people away to get themselves something to eat, Jesus says, you yourselves give them to eat. And then they question how that's possible when it takes 200 denarii, 200 days' salary of bread to feed them. And then Jesus asks, how many breads do you have? And they said, we have, 5, and there's also the fish. And Jesus multiplies them, or has everyone eat with what was available once he asked what they had. And you could, at least in part, look at this as Jesus eliciting sort of like an education, putting resources together and your thoughts and brains together to come up with a way to solve a problem, an elementary problem like eating, which without that prodding, you would not be able to get that reaction. You would have people afraid that they don't have enough. So they take the easy solution out. And here something makes sense to me that I had looked up just before I started this video and didn't know exactly how relevant it would turn out to be. But I have in my very annotated Bible a reference here to the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. Almost at the very end, it says that to compose many books is to never finish, and too much study hurts your health, it says here. In 11, it says, the words of the wise are like prods or goads or spikes that are, like stakes in the ground put by a shepherd in order to control his flock. And the Jerusalem Bible Note says that this stake or prod to sort of goad the beasts or the animals in order to make them walk, and the stakes that keep them tied are usually used by the shepherd as convenient and not whimsically, but for the good of the flock. So you have here some sort of an interesting reference to how a shepherd is going to goad his flock to do what's good for the flock, not for the shepherd. And it's interesting that in my readings I put down Kohelet 12, verse 11, uh, next to they were like sheep without a shepherd. It's also a reference to Numbers 27:17, and I think the vision in 1 Kings 22 with the prophet Micah, they were like, I saw Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd. That's a famous one. But it's interesting that you could say that the teaching of Jesus is not this information stuff so much. Just like knowledge in the Bible is intimacy rather than information, but rather a situation of hunger, big crowd, human thinking, calculates, protects itself, doesn't have enough imagination, has no leader to get them to do the right thing. That's what we lack today in the world and in America especially. You have news stations that lose viewers when the viewers don't hear what they want to hear because they've been now trained and spoiled to want to just get what they want, not real information. So then you have networks changing their misinformation to accommodate. In other words, if you're selling healthy food and the people don't come to your store, you start selling candy and junk food, and then you make a lot of money. Here, Jesus prods like a shepherd his flock to put resources together, mental and physical, to solve this problem. And so the next passage that I already mentioned is in Mark 7. You have the debate with the Pharisees about their traditions. You know, I could probably try to quickly find it just so that we can be in good shape here. You need to put a 1 then. Okay, Mark 7:1. Okay. And so you have a debate as to purity laws and things like that. And so you do have this polemic against Pharisaic halakha, or the way to walk, conduct yourself, which may be something that the early Christians encountered, but may have already been taking place in the time of Jesus' ministry. Why don't you wash before you eat? And then there's this whole diatribe against, basically swallowing the camel while straining the gnat. I don't think this comes from this chapter. It would come from Matthew 23. But the idea is the same. If you swear by the gold of the temple, it's binding. But if you swear just by the temple, it's not binding. And if you are supposed to honor your father and mother, but you sort of separate out your property as offered to God and put it in trust for God, I guess. Korban, korban, then you don't have the resources to sort of like legal loopholes, ruses. Whether it exactly happened like that or not, I don't know. I know Fitzmyer found a tomb that said the stuff inside the tomb is korban, so that no one would steal it, because people would be afraid of stealing from God. So this is not, completely far-fetched. But the point being that at least in the Gospel of Mark, just the topic, Jesus is presented as going to the heart of what Torah intended. Honor your father and mother, or don't swear at all, or don't swear by the temple. Don't honor me, as Isaiah said, with your lips merely if your heart is far from me. This would be teaching, not information, but it would be like the prodding. And then, of course, famously, he is said to have said here that nothing that comes from the outside makes you impure, but what comes out of you makes you impure. I have to confess, getting impure this morning as I was driving, because clearly people are supposed to yield to right turns if they're making a U-turn. It says it. But here in Florida, people don't like to do that. And I was coming back from church, very, orderly, and I had a beautiful green turn signal perfectly allowing me to turn right. And I didn't even pay that much attention to the normal situation, which is all these people making U-turns without yielding or even caring about those who are turning right, especially if they have a full green light to turn. And I honked my horn, and it didn't come to much more than that. But then the guy was driving very, very slowly in front of me, and I was patient. Happens he turns into the same complex that I live in. And I was upset the whole morning, even till now almost. And I said to myself, that rendered me impure in the sense that anger came out of my heart. Whereas rationally, I was in the right, because traffic laws to me are to be observed. And the accidents that we see around here are incredible sometimes. But that kind of information is not really what saves or educates you or makes you better. And he says that is what comes out of a man, which are bad intentions, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, avarices, evil deeds, fraud, uh, you know, uh, libertinage, I guess, would be, libertine behavior, envy, injuries, insolence, and just foolishness, which I think in a way I was foolish this morning. That all those perversities, all those wrong things come from within and contaminate, defile the person. And finally, as I see time always goes quickly when you're having fun, the other great connection that I think maybe Burton Mack, uh, may he rest in peace, wherever he wanted to go, I don't know. um, the Temple Act in the Gospel of Mark combines this casts out the buyers and the sellers. He teaches them that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Doesn't really have to teach that. Isaiah 56 already said that. But you have turned it into a cave of bandits. Jeremiah 7 says that. So he's not offering any new information. And but the people were astonished that the leaders, the scribes and the priests and the scribes, the high priests and the scribes wanted to find out, find a way to kill him, but they feared the crowd because they were astonished at his doctrine. Same repetition as in chapter 1. Casting out, he's teaching, people are astonished. And the only thing missing is exousia, but that comes right after. With what exousia do you do these things? And who gave you this exousia? So they're going to ask Jesus in Mark right after the temple act, which again is flanked by the fig tree. Leafy fig tree, no fruits. It's not even the season, kairos, for fruits. Does the temple act, gives the temple an infarct. Stops the blood flow by not allowing any blood vessels to be transporting anything through the temple. And then the fig tree is dried from the roots up. Damage to the heart muscle, if you will. So you have all the elements there. I just want to look at 11:18 a second and see whether they repeat the same word or not. And again, yes, they were exepleiseto epite didacheautu. They were the same astonishment over his didache doctrine teaching as they were in chapter 1. So that if you want to know these gospels and you're a beginner, you see how they are, even something simple like Mark. Supposedly his feast was a few days ago, and I did a video in English and another one in Spanish. This is why we say inspired. They are so interwoven, these parts. When the scribes, the high priest, scribes, and elders ask him, with what exousia do you do these things? And who gave you exousia to do these things? And Jesus asks about the baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? They start dialoguing within their hearts, literally. If we say from men, the people will stone us or something. And if we say from God, the question will be, why didn't you believe John if he's from God? So they couldn't answer. Well, very similar to, just to finish, in chapter 2 of Mark, with this paralytic that's lowered through the roof. They were dialoguing in their hearts. Who is this? Why is he talking like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And of course, this is a passage where Jesus says, so that you know that the Son of Man has exousia upon the earth to forgive sins. He tells the paralytic to pick up his mat and walk. This exousia upon the earth is straight out of Daniel in the Greek. God has exousia upon the earth and gives it to whomever he will. So this is sort of my reflection on Jesus as teacher uh, in the Gospel of Mark. The Son of Man, the Good Shepherd, not in those terms, but a shepherd who goes and feeds the sheep, and who heals, which is tantamount or the same as forgiving sins and their guilt, and saving and healing. And so it's like a new Torah, if you will, a new way of relating to God. Can't get around that. That is new and has this power to save, to heal, to forgive, to clean consciences. One last little line, last little stroke. Letter to the Hebrews in chapter 9 very famously says, compares the blood of bulls and goats, and it's at the aspersion of the ashes of a heifer, etc. If they can clean, as far as the cleaning of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal spirits that entered into Jesus in the baptism, and it's a spirit of fire that causes a holocaust, how much more will the blood of Jesus, who through the eternal or maybe the perpetual fire of the altar spirit offered himself blameless to God, will he not purify from dead works our consciences in order to worship the living God? And I will end on that note, uh, my reflection for your own reflection.